Hey, I'm Pastor Rhonda.
And I'm Pastor Seth.
You're listening to Growing Hope,
Living Faith. Well, welcome back to Growing Hope, Living Faith. This is a special edition of Growing Hope, Living Faith, and we hope to be able to do these a lot more down the road. But essentially today is about an interview that we have recently done, and we wanted to share it with you guys.
Right.
It was such a great interview.
Yes, it was.
Just amazed that we were able to do this, and so thankful to Dr. Carla Sunberg and her time that she spent with us and the words of wisdom that she had. So for those of you that may not know Dr. Carla Sunberg, or you may not run in the Church of the Nazarene circles, Dr. Carla Sunberg she was the 43rd General Superintendent of the Church of the Nazarene. And so essentially what that means is we in the Church of the Nazarene, we have 6 General Superintendents who oversee the whole function of the global Church of the Nazarene. And she was elected the 43rd. She is the second elected female GS that we have. So Nina Gunner was the first, and so she is the second one that was elected, and has been serving since 2017. And her story is phenomenal. She's pretty much done it all. She was a nurse, started out, felt called, and transitioned into studying ministry and theology. And then she went on and even got her doctorate in historical theology.
Wow.
Which is great.
Yeah, it is great. Plus, there's just so much. She was the director of Compassionate Ministries at one
in Russia.
point.
Yeah. Served as a missionary in Russia.
Yes. She's an author, speaker, you name it.
Yeah, and she talks about a book that we talk about, and we'll have a link to all of that down below. But yeah, she's written several works that are very good, and you should go check them out.
One is called Reclaiming Eve. It's a great Bible study. The book I think that you just referenced is called Faithful to the Call, and she was the editor where she gathered scholars, pastors, and ministry leaders, just experts, and they make a wonderful case for women in ministry. So I highly recommend that book. You can get that on the Foundry or Amazon, but yeah.
And we will link the Amazon at least in the description below. So if that's something you would like to check out, we would encourage you to go do that. And especially with Women's History Month, man, maybe there's no better person for us to be able to interview than Dr. Carla Sunberg. And so, man, we hope that you're encouraged by what you hear today. We hope that you enjoy, and we hope you're challenged at the same time, because this is a challenging conversation, I think, for all people. And I'm thankful that women are going to hear this, but I'm praying and hoping that the men in the audience also hear what Dr. Carla Sunberg has to say. So enjoy the interview, and here we go.
You are a general superintendent in the Church of the Nazarene, and I'm just kind of curious to hear your story about how did you get there?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Yes.
And it certainly is not an easy answer. A number of years ago, I was president of the Nazarene Seminary in Kansas City, and I had a student come up to me and say, "Has this always been your career trajectory?" And I said, "Well, certainly not." So I started out, when I went to college, I was a nursing major, and really felt that God had called me to study to become a nurse, and so I did. But part of that was that I always felt called to ministry of some sort. And at the time that I was growing up and I was in college, I never saw a woman preach.
Right.
I never heard about women preachers. So I didn't really know that that was an option. And while I felt so called to ministry, I thought, well, the best thing to do is to marry a minister, right? So the Lord brought a great minister into my life, and that's my husband. And we've had the joy of serving together in ministry now for about 40 years. So that's been a joy. So I started out as a nurse and tried to be a good pastor's wife and help out. I played the piano, I led the teams, I did all kinds of stuff. And worked as a nurse to help financially to support us, because, you don't make enough as a minister. Right. So then we ended up in Austin, Texas, and had our 2 little girls down there. And while we were down there, the leader of the World Mission Department reached out to us one day, and it was in 1992. And it was in 91. In 1991, in August, had been an attempted coup in the Soviet Union. And the doors were kind of opening for churches to be able to go there. And the head of our church, of our missions department, had just gone to Russia, Ukraine, Albania, And he wanted to tell us about this trip, and we thought, well, that's interesting. Why is he telling us about this trip? We were enjoying ministering in Austin, Texas. And he got to the end of the story, and he said, we've been praying about who ought to move to Russia and begin the work over there. And he said, my wife and I sat behind the two of you at a service last night. We were at an evangelism conference. And he said, and the Lord seemed to say, those two are the ones that are supposed to move to Russia. And he said, we don't normally do it this way. He said, but I'm just asking you whether you would pray about moving to Russia and beginning the work there.
Wow.
So in 1992, it was 6 months later, we packed up with our two little girls, left Austin, Texas, which we loved, and we moved to Russia. At that point, there was a gentleman that was head of Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, Steve Weber, and I had met him. He was just an amazing man, and I have to be thankful to him. There are many people that kind of opened up pathways in my life. Well, he talked to the regional director from Eurasia, and he said, do you plan on giving her a job? Because, we tended to just give the guys a job, he said, I think you ought to make her the director of Compassionate Ministries.
Wow.
He said, because she needs something that she's going to have for her to do.
Right.
And I thought that was so insightful, because I would have been lost if I didn't really have an assignment, and I had been successful in nursing and been a supervisor and stuff. And so I really tackled being the head of Nazarene Compassionate Ministries for the former Soviet Union, working together with my husband, and did all kinds of humanitarian work. We had huge shipments of humanitarian aid that would come. I helped to lead a nursing a continuing education program for Russian-speaking nurses, and just all kinds of stuff that we did over there. But along the way, that yearning to minister, it was always there. I always wanted to minister. And one day, we were home in the U.S. on furlough, and my husband says to me, if you would have been a boy, you would have been the preacher in the family. And the truth is that I have 3 older brothers. My dad was a minister, and, surely one of them should have had the call to preach, but they didn't.
Right.
And when my husband said that, it was almost like I could hear the voice of the Lord say, so why aren't you? And I really had to, and I said, well, Lord, I am a girl. Maybe you've noticed that. And yet the Lord was just saying, that's not an excuse. Are you going to be obedient to what I'm asking you to do? And then I also heard the Lord say, submit to the system, very clearly. And I thought, okay, because by that point I was a missionary. I was doing a lot of missionary work. I'd come home to the States and I would speak all over the place. And I thought, submit to the system. That means I've got to go through the whole course of study and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
I had actually started a master's in healthcare administration, and I told my husband, I said, I think I need to stop that. And I think I need to go to seminary. Now, we're living in Russia.
Right.
And we were starting a whole program for training up pastors in that part of the world. And so my husband at that point, he asked me, he said, could you take over that program of theological education? He said, I need you to help organize it. I did, and we were trying to develop a Russian-speaking faculty, people that would get master's degrees. Well, we have 7 of them. And so I would come to the U.S. twice a year, and I went to seminary with my native Russian speakers from Russia and Ukraine. And we all went to the Nazarene Seminary together.
Wow.
And I started at age 39, and by then I felt older, that's for sure, and wondered, can I be as bright as these young students? It was a challenge for me. It was a real challenge going from the medical world to theology.
Right.
But the Lord helped me. And finally, I finished all my studies, and I was ordained in Russia.
That's awesome.
In 2004, together with my Russian-speaking friends. We were the first group of ordinands on what's called the Russian North District. So my ordination certificate is here in my office, and it's signed by my husband, who is my district superintendent, and one of my Russian best friends, who is the district secretary. So that's pretty cool.
Wow. That is so cool.
Yeah. So that was part of the journey. So the thing about being a general superintendent, that would never have been on the radar. now here I am, this middle-aged mom, and I thought, great, I've kind of done what I was supposed to do. I've gotten ordained. The Lord brought us back to America, and we ended up at a church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Honestly, the church wasn't quite sure what to do with me. What do we do with this pastor's wife that's an ordained minister as well? But they made space for me, and my husband and I pastored there, and it was a good experience. But during that time, my husband and some other friends really encouraged me to continue my education, and I thought, you got to be kidding. That was hard enough to get that master's degree. But during that season, I ended up starting a PhD program in historical theology through the University of Manchester, the Nazarene Theological College in Manchester, England. And I would go back and forth and did that over a period of 6 years.
Wow.
And the Lord used that to really shape and form my life in so many ways. And then at the end of that time, the church appointed us as co-district superintendents of the East Ohio District. And they'd never done that before. They'd never had co-district superintendents.
Wow.
But evidently, both of us were on the list separately to be district superintendents. And we were both on their short list. And I guess they didn't know what to do with that. So they said, how about we just get both of them?
Wow.
So we did that.
That is awesome.
Also, in the meantime, and this is why God knits all this together, because we could never make this up, but I was elected to the board of trustees of the seminary in Kansas City, where I had just recently graduated from. Now, my husband had graduated from there back in 1985, so we've had great contact with the seminary and all of that. And then in 2013, 2014, there was a transition at the seminary. And I think they felt like, hey, she was able to raise money and bring students, and maybe that's what we need in a president. So they elected me president of the seminary.
Wow.
So and that was just 10 years after I had graduated from there. So when that student asked me if this had always been my career trajectory, that was funny. I thought, yeah, you got to be kidding. And then from there to be elected as a general superintendent in the Church of the Nazarene, very, very humbling. I mean, it's, again, it's not anything you ever plan to do. And what's fascinating is my dad was a general superintendent, and I'm the only child of a general superintendent ever to be elected, and it shouldn't have been me. It should have been one of my brothers, right?
Right.
But when my dad died a couple of years ago, I was going through all of his things, and there was a picture from the night of his installation as general superintendent. And I'm 18 years old, and I'm standing up there on the platform by my dad. And I just thought, who would have ever imagined? Nobody.
Right.
Nobody would have ever imagined. So, it's one of those things that you just say, this is what God does, and we just trust God for what God does. So that's how I ended up here.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, what a story. And as you were talking, in fact, you just said something along the lines, who would have ever thought, because you were the girl in the family.
That's right.
And you hadn't seen ladies preach before. And, you've been in the Church of the Nazarene, and it has always been our polity that we ordain women. But yet there you were, and you couldn't even imagine it.
Well, and I think what really happened in the life of our church is that we had a lot of women clergy right at the beginning. But there came a period of time, probably post-World War II, where we didn't encourage that many more women to go into ministry. So by the time I am coming of age, it's kind of like the first wave of women clergy are starting to kind of die out. And by 1990, about that time, we had gone all the way from having about 30% women clergy in the Church of the Nazarene down to about, I think it was 2.4%.
Wow.
In other words, pretty much getting to be almost extinct, which is why during my season of growing up, I didn't see very many, because we weren't calling them up. But there came a real transition about that time. There was an organization that developed Wesleyan Holiness Women Clergy, and they brought together all the Wesleyan Holiness denominations, and they said, if we do not emphasize the place of women clergy in our churches, they will become extinct, and there will not be a place for them. And in some ways, actually, it was kind of a reaction against some of the action taken in the 1980s by the Southern Baptist Convention,
Right.
when they took the credentials from their women who were ordained, and just saying, that influence will creep in and we won't have women clergy. And so today, we're back up to about 17-18%, which is good. So we're seeing that number really bounce back up. And I think God's just, really opening doors for his daughters to be participants in this mission.
And can you speak a little bit to the reason why it is important to have the voices of women?
Well, one reason I think is pretty obvious is that most of our churches are more than 50% female. Mm-hmm. So the people that go to our church are majority women. And so I think it's important to have women's voices representing the women that attend our churches. That's one reason. But the second reason is really, it is to provide for the full reflection of the image of God in humanity. Yeah. God said, let us create the humans, male and female. They created them, or he created them. And actually in that beginning, there's a plural form for God used there, so we believe that it's the triune God speaking and saying we need to have the full image, and that full image is male and female. Mm-hmm. And so for the full image of God to be visible in the life of the church means that we need to have women in places of leadership. Now, the thing is that it's not a man versus woman or woman versus man kind of thing. It's actually God's divine plan that when men and women partner together, there is a synergy that is created by the full reflection of the divine image of God. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to understand. This is not a feminist political ideal. This is biblical.
Right.
And then we see that all comes to fruition on the day of Pentecost.
Right.
When Peter gets up and preaches, and he quotes from Joel, but in the last days I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. My sons and my daughters will prophesy. That everything was changed in that, and that restoration of humanity in the image of God was now fully possible through the divine presence of the Holy Spirit. And so this is, our presence as women clergy is a physical and visible reference to what we believe theologically.
Mm. Right. That's so good. So good. I'm just taking it in.
Just breathing it in.
Yeah. So I was looking at the book that I mentioned when I emailed you, The Faithful to the Call. I love the book, and I would love for that to be a required reading. It's so good. But there was a quote that says, the church is healthy when God's sons and daughters are united together in the work of God. But the opposite is true. When the partnerships are broken or strained, the church itself suffers. That's where champions step in, becoming voices in the spaces. Can you address a little bit what you mean by the champions that step in? Who are these champions, and what are the things that they could do to be able to make that number? I think you said, was it 17%? 17%? How can we make that number rise? Speak to the champions.
Well, there are a lot of different champions. They could be male or they could be female. I would say in my own life, a lot of the champions have been male. And my husband is one of those champions. So, for example, my husband, he kind of jokingly uses what John the Baptist said about Jesus, I must decrease so that he may increase. He says, I have to decrease so she can increase. But there's truth to that. I told you I married a minister, and he's a great minister. And in many ways, he has just as much skill and ability to be sitting here as a general superintendent as I do. I mean, he's gotten votes for general superintendent himself in the past. Mm-hmm. And yet, he has intentionally chosen to step back.
Wow.
Because he wanted me to have space to become everything that I could be.
Wow.
I mean, that's, and there are some people that couldn't do that. And I know my dad used to talk to him and just say, I just think it's amazing what you're doing. And my husband would say, this is what I feel like I'm called to do.
Wow.
And it's not just him. It's also a dear friend over in England, Dr. Kent Brower, who's the one that I joke about being the giant thumb in my back about my PhD. But he believed in me. And I never would have done it if I didn't have people that believed in me and who said, come on, you can do it. Let me help you get through this. Let me help you think through it. And he did. And I mean, what a champion. There were people on the board of trustees of NTS that were champions who said, we want her to be our president. And they went out on a limb to say that.
Wow.
You know, so it's, it's just really interesting. So I think, and then, you know, what does it say to me? Well, it says to me that I am here where I am because of the work of God, because of the work that people have done, the doors that people have opened for me. But I'm not here just on my own, you know? It's not just about me. And so the question is, what am I going to do for the next generation or for those who come after me? I have to be a champion as well. Right? And so I have to make sure that I provide opportunities or encourage people or open doors or have, you know, say to people, have you thought about so-and-so? Those are the things that we have to do. And it takes people being intentional. Part of the reason for the intentionality is that, at least for women, we don't naturally end up in some of the spaces where people know people or where decisions are made. You know, I've learned, like the district superintendents in the United States and Canada, there's a whole group of them that love to golf together. Well, they have all kinds of relationships because the guys get together and the guys go golfing together. And that's hours of conversation. But that's not a space that I'm invited to be a part of, or that I maybe even want to be a part of because I'm probably not good at it. But there are natural spaces where relationships are developed. You know, I was at a conference the other day, and we all had to drive from one place to another. And anymore, this doesn't happen to me very much, but because most of the men that I work with are pretty, I want to say, they're just used to me, and we're just colleagues and stuff. Well, but I found myself outside of my waters, and nobody wanting me to ride in the car with them because I was a woman. And this was just 2 weeks ago. And it was just really weird. It was really weird. And I thought, okay, so there will be conversations that will happen in all these cars today as people go from site to site. And I don't get to be a part of any of those because I'm a woman. That kind of stuff happens. And so unless you have champions, you'll end up being left out.
Right. So what would you say to the female pastor, you know, that goes through that kind of thing? Because I think it's natural to feel anger, to feel left out, to feel those emotions. How do you manage those without becoming bitter when it happens all the time? I mean, you know, it happens a lot. So what would your advice be to keep our emotions from getting the best of us, to not go into the bitterness and anger?
Well, I think sometimes you just have to find a positive workaround. So I did find a positive workaround for me. I went up to a gal that I know that is the president of the Christian College Coalition, and she was riding with somebody else. And I said, I told her what happened. I said, would you like to ride with me today? And so we actually rode together for 2 days, and we had a great time. And it was kind of like, okay, we can find our own workarounds, and we're going to make it really positive, and we're going to have a good time together. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to go, okay, maybe they don't, I don't know, maybe they don't get it, maybe they don't understand or whatever, but I can't let that win the day, and I'm going to have to find a positive way to deal with it.
Right. That's good.
That is really good. As a male pastor, ordained elder, you know, I always want to make sure that I'm trying to do what I can do to support women in ministry. Unfortunately, you know, I don't know if that's always the case with some of my colleagues, and I'm so thankful for the percentages and how they're going up. And so it shows me that the Church of the Nazarene is doing what it needs to do positively to try to have an effect on this. But man, I know you talked about champions, But what would you say to maybe some people who aren't really being champions? Does the church, how are we creating accountability maybe in the Church of the Nazarene for those who may need a little bit more, assistance? I don't know. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, well, I think that some people don't think there's a problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think, so some people would say, what do I need to be a champion for?
Mm-hmm.
Or I remember years ago when we started the Nazarene Women Clergy Council, and somebody said, well, why do you need to do that? We don't have a men's clergy council.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to say, yeah, you do. It's just everything you do.
Yes,
all,
exactly.
So some people don't see it. My husband would say this. He said, I've learned so much about what happens to you and to the women. He said, because I'm married to you. Mm. And he said, but had I not been married to you and had I not experienced it, I don't think I would have believed it. Mm. And I think that's true. And so I want to give grace to those who don't really get it. However, if you were going to give advice, I would say, try to be intentional about imagining, I don't know, what this circumstance looks like or feels like to somebody else. Mm. When you go into a meeting, is it all males? Mm. Or how does everybody sit at this meeting? Or does anybody invite that lady to sit at our table with us? Mm. I think just that kind of stuff, the inclusion, the intentional inclusion. Mm. And helping people to see that. Now, the best thing you can do is just model it so that it becomes normal. Mm-hmm. And so I think for you, it is just to be, okay, so how do I model that for people? How does that look normal for people? Okay, I can do that.
That's good.
And that's all I'm asking. That's all most women are asking for is, how does it look normal? We want it to look normal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's the way of the kingdom is equality and all of that. And so it should be, just a normal thing as the way of the kingdom. And that's what we talk a lot about on this podcast is, the call of Jesus is to this equality, to this, we're all on the same playing field. And so that's beautiful. So thank you for sharing those words.
Wow. I was wondering too, you mentioned the 17%, the Church of the Nazarene is a global denomination. We're all over the world, and I love that about the Church of the Nazarene. So do you see more women in any particular region than others, or is it pretty distributed throughout the world?
It's not evenly distributed. There's some areas that are a little tougher than others. But I would say this, that they're being very intentional and working on it, even in those areas where it's tougher.
Okay.
We have probably more female district superintendents in Africa on that region than we do anywhere else. I'm kind of amazed at their acceptance of female leadership. Some countries are not as accepting, but others are very accepting. So, yeah, it is, people have kind of gotten the idea that this is what it means to be Nazarene. And I'm really impressed with that. I recently got a video from the district superintendents in Brazil. There are 21 of them. And they are concerned enough that maybe people don't get it, that all 21 of them were sending me a video and asking me, when are you going to come be our general superintendent? We need you to come to Brazil and ordain people because we need them to see it.
Wow.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is cool. That's very cool. Wow. Well, I have just another couple of questions. I am the coordinator for the women clergy in the state of Georgia, and we have several women that are in the course of study, and they're just getting their feet wet in ministry. What would if you could just give a single piece of advice to these young women that are up and coming, that are just getting started, what would your advice be?
My biggest piece of advice would be to spend time with Jesus and do everything you do out of your love and your motivation to serve Jesus. If we don't, we'll get frustrated by things that happen to us, but this call is for us to be ministers and to help bring people to Christ. And we always have to leave that call in the front of everything that we do. And so if doors don't open, or you don't have maybe the church you thought you should, or whatever, nobody can take your call from you. Mm-hmm. Nobody can stop you from sharing the love of Christ in this world. And I would just encourage you, always let that be the first thing on the front burner.
Mm. And what would you say as far as education? How important is education?
Well, that's a really interesting question about education, and so I might speak out of my mouth both ways. First of all, I'm going to say this, that for any woman or minority, if you're going to be in a position of leadership, you almost have to have more education. And so I really encourage people to get the education that they need and to study hard. However, those degrees are not guarantees of anything.
Right.
And a degree is not a guarantee that the Holy Spirit is flowing through you in what you're doing.
Right.
Good.
So I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. One side says, you know, you need to be educated with what you're doing, because I really believe it's so important to know who we are. You need to know how to preach. You need to know how to share about your faith and articulate it really well. I think that's really, really important. But don't think that your degrees are the end-all to end-all.
Right. Perfect answer. Very good. This may be a silly question, but is there a question that I have forgotten, that I've neglected, that I should have asked, that you can think of?
Well, sometimes people assume that maybe things have been easy for me because I've ended up where I am. And so sometimes people will ask what the difficulties are, and I'm not really good at wanting to answer those.
Right.
Maybe someday I'll write a book about that after everybody's gone to heaven. But I do want to say this, that even where I am, the road has not been easy. I believe the Lord has brought me to this place. But there have been times I've been hurt. There have been days I've been deeply wounded. But we have to let God work and heal through all that, because if we're gonna hang in there and make a difference, we have to hang in there. And someday maybe I'll tell some of those stories. But I just want you to know it's not always been easy. And you know, I will share even this. Even my father struggled with my call, because my father thought that my call might make my husband look bad, or that I would overshadow my husband. And there's one moment that just sticks with me, and I was in England, and I was working on my PhD, and my husband had come along and was having vacation, and I had Skyped my parents that night, and at the end of the phone call, my dad said, "Just tell Chuck how proud I am of him." I said, "Okay, I'll tell Chuck how proud you are of him."
Wow.
You know, and it was almost like he was saying, "Well, I'm proud of him for putting up with you with what you're doing." And there was the little girl in me that wanted Dad to be proud of me.
Wow.
But when I would succeed, my dad would always, instead of praising me for what I did, my dad would ask me, "How's your husband coping with it?"
Wow.
And it was almost a feeling of, I can't tell Dad if I did a good paper, or I did a good presentation, or I did this or that, because if I did well, I almost thought my dad won't be happy with me. Now, my dad came around eventually, but he came around because my husband had to go have a talk with him.
A champion.
Yeah.
He did. He had to sit my dad down, and he had to say, "Dad, this isn't good." He said, "You can't be doing this to Carla." And he said, "I need you to know I'm okay with what's happening."
Wow.
And my dad would say, "Oh, but you need to share your voice." And Chuck said, "Carla's voice and my voice are pretty much the same voice."
Yeah.
Wow.
And he said, "Dad, the church needs to hear it from her voice, not from mine."
Wow. Wow. Your husband is a champion. Wow.
Yeah, he's a real champion. Real champion. Yep.
Wow. So it hasn't been easy, but like you said earlier, God accomplishes His will, and He's had His hand on you, and He has opened doors for you, and you have made a huge difference in the kingdom of God.
Well, I hope so. I want to do it for God's glory, that's for sure.
Right. Wow, God's glory.
So good.
That's what it's all about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about God getting the glory. And, it's not about women in ministry just for the sake of having women in ministry.
Right.
It is about God calls women and men to reflect His glory.
And His image.
Yeah. And so when one doesn't get to do that, then that's a problem. But wow, there was so much good in this interview, and I just want to bring up the book again.
Yeah.
Faithful to the Call. If you want to know more about women in ministry, where they get a little more into the theological reasoning, and there's just more information. I could have talked to her for probably another hour, but Faithful to the Call, I highly recommend. It's a great book.
Absolutely. And there will be a link for that in the description down below. So feel free to go check that out.
Yeah.
And we won't get any kickbacks on that, but we just want to make sure we promote that book.
And I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Carla. That
Absolutely.
was awesome.
So good. Yeah, and so this is a special edition. Once again, we're dropping this on a Tuesday. Our normal podcasts come out on Thursday, and so if you're not a normal listener, usually what we do is we journey through the lectionary passages and kind of look at the stories of Scripture. Today, we wanted to just kind of focus on a person's story, and hopefully we're going to be doing more of this down the road, where we'll be able to drop an interview potentially on Tuesday, continue on with our normal podcast on Thursdays. And so, man, we're so glad that you listened to Growing Hope Living Faith. If you would like to reach out to us, we do have a Facebook page. It's a Growing Hope Living Faith podcast. And you can go there and leave messages or do whatever you want to do.
We have email.
Yeah, we also have an email address, absolutely, which is growinghopelivingfaith@gmail.com. You can reach out to us there, and if you have comments, concerns, prayer requests, any of that kind of stuff, feel free to reach out to us, and we would love to hear from you there. But man, thanks once again so much for listening. A special thank you to Dr. Carla Sunberg, and we hope that you enjoyed today's podcast. Grace and peace. God bless. Bye-bye.